wonderful hillside opportunity and the potential for lots of water, you need a good plan. And Carol Marrero has just that plan. Carol, this is amazing.
Thank you, thank you. It's been an exciting adventure. I call it my outdoor laboratory because I've learned so much in the last 3 years.
Well, I cannot imagine what it looked like during the flood of 2010.
It was difficult for me to believe because the day before that flood, I had 7 yards of topsoil delivered because I was going to take care of my erosion problem. And the day of that flood, I realized it wasn't how much soil I brought in, it was what I needed to do with my stewardship, my environmental stewardship, to control or manage. I guess you can't control water, but you can manage it. And what I needed to do in my stewardship to do just that, so I could protect the wetlands across from our property and Apple Creek that feeds into Mill Creek. What was my responsibility?
Well, and Mill Creek has the endangered Nashville crayfish in it.
You know, I learned that the year prior to the 2010 flood, I decided that I needed to learn more about my environment here in Tennessee, so I was fortunate enough to go through the Master Gardening Program. But after the flood, I scrapped all plans that I had for bringing in soil and plants, and I knew that it was water that I needed to face. So I partnered with two wonderful groups here in Davidson County, one Cumberland River Compact, and then Tennessee Yards and Neighbors. In fact, you taught that class for 2 different weekends on stormwater. And what we as individual homeowners have the responsibility of protecting our groundwater, our runoff, our streams. So I didn't do it by myself. I did it with a team. With the volume of stormwater, I knew that just a rain garden wasn't going to work for me. How could I utilize that? So I put in what I call my water management or my water harvesting. I wanted to use that. And so I put in nearly 200 feet of perforated pipe in multiple areas. And you know, about stormwater or about deluge of water, you want to slow that deluge down. And so before I even buried it, I put my drain pipes out on the surface. I stabilized them with rebar. And then even at night, I would run out in my jammies and my umbrella with a flashlight looking to see if I was slowing that deluge down. And when I did, how far out was it irrigating my plants? And once I felt really good about that, then I went to my neighbors. And you know, that's important because they have runoff on their driveways, on their hillsides. And I'm very fortunate, my husband and I are very fortunate to have neighbors that were so willing and eager for me to do this. So we have a drain pipe on our neighbor's side that drains half of their roof and their driveway. We have our roof and driveway covered. And then what I did, I still had extra water coming out those pipes. So I built a rain basin. And the first one I built was up without a lot of rock. Without mortar. It was my first phase, and it kept filling with silt. So just a year ago, I had an 18-inch deep or high basin made, and of course checked my filtration rates, and that basin will fill a couple of times a year, but the filtration rate is so good, Julie, that within less than an hour, it's drained. And so my goal was not to lose a cup of water or a teaspoon of soil from our hillside, and I've been able to achieve it. And I needed, in my measurements, to have a minimum of 18-inch deep trenches. Well, and then you line those trenches with pebble. That gives more filtration rate for the perforated pipe so they don't fill up. And I thought, well, if I go to all that trouble to put that pipe in, if I ever need to dig it, I'm not going to redig my entire hillside. I want to know where it is. So on our side, I chose to put sod. So I laid down sod, and easy to trim, easy to maintain. And because our dear neighbors both still work, that was not an elective, I thought. And so what I've done is planted native plants in their trench, and coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, And that's just so that it protects me in the future. If I need to dig it up, I know where to go.
Well, that's very smart, and planning is so evident throughout all of this. Now I can see here where you put in these drains that drain off of your driveways here, and that must go to that perforated pipe.
It does. Observation and planning is just key, because I wanted to make sure everything that I did was stable, that it was usable, and that stable means that it was lasting. No rework for this kiddo. And so in the 3-year plan, I knew that the south side of our property had the biggest impact on erosion. So that's where I started. And then behind us, if you look at this steep hillside, I have still drain pipes perforated that water a lot of the upper side of the garden, but I still had erosion.
Carol, the rock that you have here is absolutely incredible, and I can't imagine what it would have taken to have gotten it here and where it would have come from.
Well, that's one thing, Julie, I didn't have to worry about, because this hillside, except for the understory trees, I planted everything. And I will tell you is I've worn out many pairs of pants crawling around on my knees with a pickaxe. And I say a pickaxe because under every little teaspoon of soil there appeared to be rocks of all sizes. And so what I would do, of course I started at the top and I worked from south to north, just because that was where I had my biggest water issue. But I would pile these rocks up in different sizes, and I made a commitment that nothing was leaving this hillside, nothing, that I would utilize in my stewardship everything that was here. The good fortune for me is with this hillside, I call it my vertical garden, I was able to use everything. For example, around all the trees, so that the soil wouldn't wash down and then bury that trunk. You know how susceptible trees are. They're big, they're humongous, and so we think they're hardy, but they're just as prone to disease and insects if they're weakened. So I wanted to make sure I protected them. So I took the rocks and I utilized those around all the trees. And then to keep the erosion, I started with this hill, and then I realized I still had an erosion problem, and I didn't have a problem with what I was going to do with rocks. And I have a wonderful man and his father that were able to take the rocks that I unearthed and built yet barriers, and those barriers now have afforded me a place to plant. So, you get your function and your beauty, form and function out of this.
Well, you've really used the resources here
Yes.
well in terms of capturing that water and capturing the rocks and using them in a beautiful way. Now, what about the plants? What really affected your plant choices for all of this?
Well, first of all, the choices were, and I learned this through my master gardening, is that if you're going to plant a plant, have it so that it's in the right place, right plant, right place. So in studying a runoff, the water, the next thing I studied was the light patterns. And then I chose native plants predominantly. I would say that out of the 250 different types of plants that I have, and again, that's diversity, that's sustainability. But I chose things that were held back water. Well, natives have a strong, deep root system. For example, in my basin, I have black-eyed Susans. They're very drought tolerant, but they can enjoy a little wet feet from time to time. Many different ways of planting and choosing what you do, but native for me is the only way that I go, the sustainability of them.
Well, and I really like the natural look that you have in your beds. You're not using a dyed mulch. It looks like you're using leaves and compost.
That's exactly what I do. And in fact, I take every leaf off of our trees here, and then I like to think of myself as a non-beggar, but I'm not above asking my neighbors if I can have their leaves. And then I compost those, put them in 50-gallon bags so that I can bring them up the hill myself. And the exciting thing about this, and of course I learn every day, and that's why I call it my laboratory, is not only does it feed the plants, but this leaf mulch actually holds the water, and that helps from having, the water just run off quickly. So I have not had, knock on wood, with my planning and doing the right applying the right principles and disciplines, I haven't had any runoff for the last 2 years. What I did with that basin, just to make sure that I didn't lose water and have yet another runoff problem, is I put a secondary flow at the end of this, and you see the perforated pipe here, and I protect my water a little bit by coming out into this area, and that happens a couple of times a year, but just by a few inches. The other thing that I've done, I call it my three-way plan to make sure that I can still boast to myself about not losing water and soil, is you'll see the additional, I call it a fence of rocks, and then my liriope. So that's my last two defenses against losing anything into the wetlands. We have 7 springs along this HOA walking trail, and I just don't want to injure that or impair it from going into Apple Creek. Gee, I hate to admit this, but years ago I didn't think anything about a stormwater drain. Not at all. And then during that flood, and our streets were just running rivers, and I saw those stormwater drains filling up with debris, not just mine, but everybody's. And then I saw the deluge of water coming down the driveway. It was frightening. And I saw the deluge of water coming down this walking trail, so much so that there were 4 of us watching this, and we were all fearful of stepping into it, that we'd be washed away. And the power of water, and then being able to say, okay, I can't control it, but there has to be a way to manage to it.
Well, this is such a wonderful property, and it is so inspiring to see what you've done out here, Carol. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. And it's especially impressive to think about the amount of work that can be done once you start planning and once you start observing, and especially taking advantage of all these resources. So whenever you're looking at your property, take a little tip here from Carol, observe, plan, and take a look at all of your resources that you have to deal with what's happening, because it might be your property, but it's all leading to something that belongs to all of us, our water.